Hi everyone. Well, as I was reviewing what I thought was two videos that I recorded this morning, uh, as you'll see from video one, I got just over 9 minutes in that video and I had a pop-up interrupt, and I thought I just simply clicked off of it and resumed my video, and what it had done was literally turned off the video. I was like, oh, gee, thanks so much for that. So I'm prattling along, and you guys would have met our cat that I always say is not our cat, although he's our cat now. He heard me in here talking in that first video and started meowing at the doors off the library here on our deck, and he was wanting in. So, he waltzed around here for a little bit and got to be on camera. And as I say, wasn't our cat. We didn't think we were cat people, but he belongs to our neighbor actually that lives just north of us. But we used to put out food for strays on our front porch, and he was consistently coming around. We'd find him in our backyard, and he was so skittish and standoffish that we started thinking, well, he must be feral and the poor thing needs to eat. So we started putting out food for him, and then, of course, like cats do, other ones got the message and they started coming around. And so I told my husband, I said, I feel like we're trolling for cats because at one point we had 6 or 7 cats, plus a possum, plus some raccoons, and the raccoons were problematic. So we were trying to decide what to do. Little Bert finally allowed. One day I was out there putting out fresh water and food, and he suddenly came up to me and let me pet him. And after that, we made nice, and he started wanting in the house, and so we let him in for little stretches. He's really an outside cat, and we're not exactly set up here. As you can see, I have, a plant stand here with a blown glass decanter and then stones. I've got a lot more stones. Got stones everywhere. And these are just the little guys. But anyway, so Bert made an appearance, and then I let him out, and I continued on, and I shared all about my dog stories, well, many of them, and pictures. And then I got a coughing jag, and I hit pause, and for some reason the some reason was that when I had that pop-up occur, it apparently stopped the video. So all of that I had recorded did not record. So I'm doing this again for the middle section. You're going to see me in a plaid shirt that I wore when I went grocery shopping, and then I had wrapped what I thought was the second part of the video to finish. After getting up and getting lunch for while Walter was in getting his lunch, I had paused it. That time it did pause and finish up the recording. But it looks like where it had stopped just as I was about to introduce what I consider to be one of my adult very first dogs. Sooner was a dog that was born out of a litter in California when I was still there. And at the time, the boyfriend I had and I had moved in together in a townhouse down in San Jose area. And in fact, it was just off Highway 17, which it takes you up into Los Gatos and down to the coast where Santa Cruz is, which were two of my favorite haunts if you're familiar at all with that part of the lower peninsula of the Bay Area. But we were living there in that townhouse, and Chocolate, his dog, got pregnant by a pit bull in our neighborhood. And so she had this litter of pups, and we got homes for all of them, and this little guy was gone from us for about 3 weeks, and then the family kids of the family I let have him, brought him back and said, "Can you take him back, because we're having to move and our new place won't allow pets?" And so I said, "Well, of course I'll take him back." And so I had Sooner, and I named him that because they had named him Sabbath, which I didn't like the connotation of that. Because of course my mind went immediately to the band Black Sabbath, and I thought, no. So I started calling him Sooner. And then the other thing I became quickly aware of, because I love to snuggle with my animals, and every time I'd pick him up to snuggle him, he'd start nipping at my hands and my fingers, and I thought, uh-oh, these kids have been a little bit rough with him. So I just sit sometimes for an hour and love on him and hold him and just remind him that hands could be nice things. They did nice things. They didn't just always hit and tease. And then he came around, and he and we were like kindred spirits, that dog. I had to put him with a neighbor for a short time, for a couple months actually, until I figured out what my living arrangement was going to be, because the boyfriend and I had gone separate ways, and I was staying, I was going to say couch surfing, but it was my couch. I had a friend that had a little one-bedroom apartment and not a lot of furniture. So I asked her if she would be willing to let me put my sofa bed. I had a sofa sleeper at the time. I said, could I put that in your living room and put my high boy dresser in your bedroom for clothes, and just stay with you for a couple of months until I can get myself sorted. And she agreed, and so I was paying half the rent with her and utilities and all that, and kind of helping her out too. But I had neighbors down there in San Jose that were watching the dog for me, and I would go down on weekends and get him and bring him up to the apartment and have him for the weekend and then take him back down. But when I made the decision to leave California for the last and final time, this was now the fall of 1980, and I would say that Sooner was probably about 6 months old at the time, and my father flew out to help me drive a U-Haul, and we were towing my car behind the U-Haul, so he was helping with me relocate and get all that done. So that's when he first started meeting Sooner in his little personality, and he kept saying, this is a smart dog. This is a very smart dog. And I said, I know. He's amazing. He learns so quick. And I said, I swear he knows exactly what I'm saying to him. And this was before I ever understood about animal communication. And we noticed he curled up in the seat on the big truck rig that we were driving. They have the one solid seat. And he curled up between us the whole trip, right up until we hit the turnoff there in Utah, northern Utah, to turn into the town of Ogden, which is where my parents had retired to. And I had lots of relatives there. My mother is from southern Utah, and her sister and brothers had pretty much all stayed in Utah in one area or the other. So my sister and I grew up summers in Utah, and lots of gatherings with family and lots of cousins. So, and my cousin Kathleen, who I had mentioned in the first part of the first video that suggested I do this, she was living in Ogden, and so it made it an easy decision to decide to relocate and move there. But as soon as we hit the border of Ogden, that dog sat up, and he started putting his nose further and further to the front window of the truck. And as we got closer, pretty soon his paws were up on the dashboard. and he was like at attention, like he had just uh, spotted game, and he wasn't a hunting dog, but you know, he knew the scent, and my dad kept saying, that dog knows we're just about there, because he sniffed my dad up one side and down the other when he first met him. And he says, I know he smells the smells that he was smelling on my clothes when he first met me 2 days ago. And he says, I think he knows exactly where we're going. And he did. He didn't come off alert until we pulled in the driveway, and then he sat anxiously waiting to get out and get in the yard and run around. But he was an amazing dog. I just could go on forever about Sooner. But this is a little bit later. For some reason, I was having a difficult time coming up with photos. Weird. I guess I pulled them for other things, and they didn't get back into the proper area. But this is Sooner at probably age 7, because there's his little mate, Shadow, who we'll talk about next. But Sooner is the one sitting up like a big boy waiting for his treat. And that, of course, is me, a much younger me with dark and longer and way thick and curly hair. The curls have kind of diminished over time, but they're still around. But anyway, that's Sooner and Shadow. And Sooner was an interesting dog. Like I said, he very wicked smart, understood everything. I used to do everything with that dog. I'd take him, there was a really nice park by my parents' house when we first moved there. And I would walk him over to the park, and he loved to chase frisbees. So I always had a cache of frisbees for this dog, because he also chewed them when he'd had enough. He wanted a fresh one, he'd just start chewing on the other ones. So anyway, I'd take him to the park, and that dog, like grease lightning. I think eventually we timed that dog running alongside our car on a mountain road doing 45 miles an hour, and he was pacing us and keeping up with us and getting ahead of us at times, but we couldn't go any faster because of the road. So a massive, powerful animal. And there were it was a park. There was all kinds of area for kids to play on things, and they had a slide. My mistake. I taught that dog how to climb a ladder, the slide ladder. And he would climb up there, and then down he'd go, and then he'd run around it, and he'd just do this over and over and over again. Well, the reason why it was a big mistake is later when we moved to Arizona after I met and married my husband, and we spent our first couple of years there in Ogden, and then we relocated to Arizona. And we had chain link fence. Yes, Sooner figured out very quickly. He sat there looking at that chain link and puzzling. Pretty soon he climbed it like a ladder. Bing, 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 bing. And off he'd go. Well, that dog loved to watch television. Don't ever let a vet or anyone else tell you that dogs can't see TV, because we've proven to many that they do. And he loved television. His favorite show at the time was You Ask For It. They remade that in the 80s from an earlier late 60s, early 70s show. And they had, put a little more into it. But he loved that show. And he would, the minute it was time for You Ask For It, he would run into the living room, plop himself down in front of the TV, waiting on somebody to turn on the TV so he could watch his show. And he eventually learned how to turn on the TV by himself. But anyway, when we moved to Arizona, we had a little black and white TV. We didn't bring the big console color TV with us. We didn't initially move down with all our stuff. We had to have it shipped down later. And apparently he was very feeling put out that he had to watch a black and white TV. And I found out later, dink, 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 going over the fence, that at a certain time every day he disappeared for about an hour. And then he'd come back. And I didn't realize for a while that he was even gone until we had made friends with some people that lived in the grouping of apartments just north of where this fourplex was that we lived in. And and we love to play cards, so we would get together several times a week to play cards with this couple. And the husband says to us, "Do you know that your dog comes and visits me every afternoon?" And I'm like, "He does what?" He says, "Yeah, and he's very particular. He wants to watch that show. You ask for it." And he says, he does it every weekday. He says, "I just leave when it gets close to time for that show to come on. I just open my front door because I know Sooner's going to show up. And he comes in the house. He sits down on the floor next to me on the couch, and he watches his show. And as soon as it's over, he looks over at me like, 'Okay, see you tomorrow.' And he leaves. And I shut the door, and I see him the next day. And I'm like, 'Oh, for crying out loud, I'm so sorry.'" And I was rather embarrassed. He goes, "Oh, I love it." He says, "I don't give him snacks or anything, but he sure loves that show, and he comes and watches it." I said, "Well, we just have a little portable black and white that used to be in my bedroom, and before I was married, and that's what we brought down to watch until we get our furniture and stuff down here." So apparently he thinks he's being hard pressed to watch a black and white TV. But yeah, that dog was just wicked smart. He got stolen one time in the middle of a really nasty blizzard. And if you've ever been in northern Utah or Idaho, Montana, they get some hellacious winters, or they sure could. And we had a neighbor that stole him and took him up over the pass to another area completely beyond us. And what he didn't know is that my dog and I used to hike that mountain every morning for about the first 3 months I had moved and relocated to Utah, because I was sorting through things, and that's where I always go to, is nature, when I've got a lot of mental sorting to do. And so, Sooner and I were out on the mountain in the North Pass, in Weber Canyon Pass, the north end. And we were out there dutifully by 6 a.m. every day, because I would do that hike and then come home, shower, and go to work. And so the smells, I'm sure, were familiar to him, and I think that's where he must have taken him, is to this area called Huntsville that's on the other side, between it's a valley between mountain ranges. But he was gone for almost 3 days, and like I say, he took him in a blizzard. I guess he figured he would really confuse the dog by, he wouldn't be able to find a scent or anything. He did not know the dog he was dealing with. And when Sooner found his way home, he was filthy with caked mud. I could tell he had been digging himself in at night to stay warm, so he was protected from the snow. And his tail was broken, and we figured out by listening to Sooner share with me what happened, that this guy had just simply opened up his truck door, didn't hardly even slow down, and just kicked the dog out of the truck, and apparently that's when he broke the tail. But yeah, that neighbor, first time I brought Sooner out of the house after he'd found his way home, and I leashed him because I knew the neighbor had been involved, and I was absolutely certain the dog had told me the truth, because that neighbor saw Sooner on a leash, and his eyes just got big as saucers, and Sooner was straining on his lead, just growling. And if I would have turned him loose, he would have gone after that guy. The guy was a real jerk. Anyway, so Sooner told us true, and Sooner was a good read of people. That dog, for all the years, like I say, he was so protective of me. And in fact, when I got pregnant with my daughter, my first child, my mother said, "Oh, I think you better get rid of the dog, because he's so devoted to you. He'll probably be very jealous of the kids." And I said, "No, not this dog. This dog is very smart." And as it was, when I was single and I'd be dancing in the house, that dog would get up and put his front paws on my shoulders, and he'd dance with me. We'd dance around in the living room. Sometimes he'd step on my feet so I could dance with him. And he was very devoted. And so if I loved something, he was going to love it. And sure enough, those babies could crawl all over him. They could do it. And when I had my son a year after my daughter, and he never nipped. He just, in fact, my daughter ended up that she had been a preemie and was actually blind from too much oxygen. And so he sensed that early before we had ever had a diagnosis. And that child, I mean, my son was more, he was a rambunctious little boy, and so Sooner would move away from him or get out of his way because he'd grab at his fur or his ears. And so if he wasn't in the mood, he'd just get up and move. But not with my Katie. Katie could crawl all over that dog. She could lay on him. She could do whatever she wanted to him, and he just never dared move. He sensed that it would startle her or confuse her because, like I say, he knew she was blind before we did. But yeah, he was very protective of the kids when they were little. He was always keeping an eye on them, and especially if I told him, keep an eye, boy, he'd keep an eye. And he was very devoted to, here's another one of him and him and Shadow. Shadow we got when he was 5 years old, and we had been looking for a little black and white pit because, like I say, he was a pit bull mix, and we wanted to breed them. We wanted a breeding pair. And I just knew with his intelligence, and if we could find the right pit bull, that they would be a great combination. And she was the runt of her litter. She was the very last one left when we called to see if they still had puppies. And they said, well, we have one, but she's really tiny. She's not going to be very big. And I said, well, that's perfect. She sounds perfect. So we got to meet the parents, and the mother was like 125 pounds. The dad had a lot of mastiff in him, so he was huge. They said he was over 200 pounds, and I could believe it. He had a head like a bowling ball. And luckily, as you can tell by the photo, I think at the most, Shadow only ever weighed about 52 pounds, and I used to say she was a 52-pound tongue because all she ever wanted to do was lick on you, and she'd lick you up one side and down the other, and she was not an aggressive dog. She was second, and with Sooner being the protector he was, she never felt like she had to engage. If something was going on, she'd back him up and stand behind him, ready for encounter if necessary. But you could tell she was always hoping that wasn't the case. And after she became an only dog for a little while, the poor thing, she'd bark, and if she was nervous about somebody at the porch or whatever, she'd bark and growl, and then she'd go run and climb under my daughter's bed and hide under there and shake for the longest time because she just didn't have an aggressive bone in her body. She just was just a sweet mama dog is what she was. And when we first got her, she fit in the palm of your hand, and I'd carry her around in my pocket. And then once we got her home and she got comfortable to the routine, she was the worst. She'd come running through down the stairs, and she would come flying, and I had this one kind of a terry cloth house coat that I would wear, and I would sit, and so it made like a little kangaroo pouch, and she would come and dive in there, and like a little hammock, she'd rock herself to sleep, but she'd stay there as long as I would stay sitting. And that was her routine until one day she went and dove in that thing, and her butt hit the she looked at me so funny. I'm like, well, you've outgrown your little pouch. You've got to find another idea. But Sooner just thought she was obnoxious because she just teased him, nibbled at his ears, and he would sit down in exasperation and stretch out his front legs, and she'd get between his legs, and she'd just curl up there and go to sleep, and he'd put his head on her, rest his head on her, I think mostly to keep her pinned, and the two of them would sleep like that until she got older. And he just thought, why did you bring this little upstart here? And then at about 9 months, 10 months, she got a scent, and then he got a scent. And then he's like, oh, I understand now why you brought this little gal home. Okay. And over time, they had 3 litters of puppies together. We spaced them out well. Um, but she just was the perfect mama dog. But she was so much my shadow, and we named her perfectly because even if you weren't sure where she was in the room, you knew she was close by, and usually it was either right to the side of your chair or right behind it. Always close to her humans. And she wouldn't have her litters until I would come in and midwife for her. She wouldn't stay in her little whelping bed, nothing. And we always set her up in our bathroom so she'd have privacy and we could close her off from the rest of the house and from Sooner until, well, he always wanted to see the puppies. He was always so excited that they had another litter of pups. So usually it was, usually 24 hours before a female will leave her litter long enough to go outside and potty and maybe get some food. And as soon as she was, and I told him, you be patient. As soon as she goes out, I'll let you see the puppies. And so he'd wait and he'd hear me shut the back door to let her out. And I'd look up, I'd say, okay, Sooner, let's go see your puppies. And he'd follow me into the bathroom in the master, and he'd just stand there and he'd be so proud. He'd stick his chest out and, oh, look what I've done. I made another beautiful litter of puppies. And he'd sniff them all, and he was very sweet with them too. But as I say, very good communicator. He always had a way of letting me know. If he didn't like someone, my husband and I cast no aspersions on bikers because I think they get a bad rap, but like anything else, there's 1%ers. And my first husband never affiliated with any clubs, but he rode with a lot of different bikers. And so if they came to the house and there was something off about one of them, I might open the door and let him in, but Sooner would just back them right to the wall and keep them pinned there. They didn't go anywhere, and they didn't stay very long. And they're like, you gonna call off your dog? I'm like, no. Is he gonna bite me? Well, he hasn't so far, but I wouldn't make any fast moves, and I'm sorry, there's something about you he doesn't like. So, and they'd, sure enough, within very short order, we'd find out what the reason was. And yeah, and they would no longer be welcome at our house. And nor did they really want to come around or come inside because they knew that dog he could do some damage if he wanted to. And he never was really aggressive to anyone. But we did have a couple of close calls, and there was a particular porcupine one year, a young one, that he came back to our camp, and he had a face full of quills. And I said, oh no, Sooner, what have you gotten into? And my then husband says, well, come on, Sooner, show me where this happened. And he took him to the tree, and he said there was this young porcupine clinging to this tree with its whole back tore out, which is obviously when the thing threw quills. And he said, well, you won't do that again. Not to me. And so yeah, that was the end of that poor little porcupine. And then we had to get those quills out of poor Sooner, and he never went after another one. He learned his lesson. But yeah, for some reason, I think it was because the little porcupine threw quills at him. He was probably being curious, as he was prone to do, and he wasn't afeared of anything. So, but Sooner, I had Sooner till he was almost 13, and he had this was a couple of years after I divorced my first husband, and he, in fact, this was pretty close to that time. And you can see in this picture of he in shadow, look at her white muzzle. She's starting to gray out, so she's got to be every bit of probably, well, if he was, well, I guess he was older than 13, because she's definitely older than 7 here in this photo. So she's probably about 8 or 9, which probably puts him more like 14. But anyway, he had one particular weekend, I had let him out and gone back to bed. And I heard him bang into the front door, and I opened the door, and he walked in kind of funny, and he was stumbling, and I was like, "What? Did you fall asleep in the chair on the porch and your leg go to sleep or something? You know, what's going on with you?" And then I realized by watching him, his head was off to one side, and he was dragging one side. And I said, "Okay, this dog's had a stroke." And I had always promised that dog that when his time came, because he was such a noble animal, he did not like to appear weak. He did not like to appear disoriented, and he was getting all of that. He had started having accidents in the house, and when I'd say, "Sooner, what are you doing?" And he'd look so shocked at me, and then he'd look down and realize he was wetting on the floor, and then he'd be so humiliated, and I'm like, "It's all right. You're an old man. It happens to all of us." And I was not old at that point, but I said, "It's okay, Sooner. You didn't do that on purpose." And so anyway, I told him, "If you start failing, I will have you put down and allow you your dignity. I won't drag it out for my own selfish reasons and make you suffer in any way." So I watched him over that weekend, and I saw that stroke was not resolving. I really hoped that it was just like a TIA and he'd come around, but he did not. So that Monday I got home from work, and I took him to the vet, and I had him euthanized. And I had an appointment the next day to have Sugar, to have her get her little hysterectomy, her spay. And I should say, let me just backtrack a little bit. When Sooner was 9 and they were done with puppies, I took him, I made an appointment for him to get neutered. And the vet called me and said, "Oh, it's a good thing you scheduled this when you did, because this poor guy is, he's got blood in his urine, and so he's probably prostate is giving him fits. He's been intact a long time, and you said he's been inbreeding. He had several litters with his mate. So the way we correct that is to neuter them." And so the timing was right, but he got home, and next couple of days, and the first time he checked his nether regions, he looked at me, because I used to tease him and say, "If you don't calm down, I'm gonna have him take your nuts." Sorry to be so crude, but he'd look at me like, "You're gonna do what to me?" But that was the look I got from him when he looked down there and saw he was missing something, and he's like, "Hey, you weren't kidding." But I did ask the vet before he was fixed. I said, he and his mate are so devoted to each other. She has him preen and groom her, and she loves to wrap her paws around his neck while he does that, and she nuzzles his ears. And will he continue to be sweet with her, like that? Or will his drive be just completely gone? And he says, "Well, I'll tell you," he says, "what we find is that if they've been a functional, intact male for long enough," he said, we take their testicles. We don't give them a lobotomy. So if that's the way he's been with her, he will continue to be that way." And he still was very devoted to her and very affectionate. So after he passed, it was ironic that I had to take him and have him euthanized. And the next day, prior to all of that going on, I had an appointment set for her to have her procedure done. And at the same time, I said, "Go ahead and update all of her boosters, and if she's ready for her rabies, do that." Because she had lost her collar, so I didn't have any tags or anything for her, so I was getting all of that straightened out at the same time. But Sooner had his collar, which I still have to this day. And so she got used to the tinkling sound of his his tags clinking together. And so she came home from her little set too, and she was very, out of it because of her surgery, very depressed because she had just lost her mate. And the first time she could get up and really put some prance in her step, she heard her tags clink together, and she looked up so excited, and she came running down the hall, and she's looking all over for Sooner. I knew that's what it was. And she looks at me and her head drops, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, baby. Those are your tags making that noise. You have tags again. And so just when you hear those, just think happily about Sooner. And that can be a nice reminder for you about Sooner. But I couldn't replace him. You don't ever replace a dog anyway, but it was a full year before I could entertain the thought of another dog. And I guess probably because I had Shadow, and so at least I wasn't completely dogless. But at the same time, she was fading. She was so despondent without him. She had never been an only dog. Like I said, she was 5 weeks old when we brought her home. So she had always been with him. And I decided, okay, it's time. And it happened that I was working outpatient rotations at the hospital. My background is physical therapy. And so I had a patient whose he and his wife's dog had had a litter of puppies. And he was describing them to me, and I said, oh my gosh, they sound so adorable. And he says, well, do you think you're ready for another dog? And I said, well, whether I am or not, I think I need to get one for Shadow, because we're just watching her fade as each month goes by. And he says, okay, well, I'll tell you what, they're ready to go to Homes next week. So he gave me his address and everything, and they had a ranch just not 2 miles from me. And so I said, okay, the kids and I'll come up on Saturday. And so we did. And I want to show you this. This is Shadow, and she's getting ready to play with a toy there. That's her let's play mode, the stance she would go into. And we hadn't seen that look in a very long time. This is the look we were seeing from her most days. Up on my waterbed, looking at me like, woe is me. Oh, I think I'll just go to sleep. In fact, I think I woke her up to take that picture of her. But look at those sad eyes. And then we brought home these two hooligans, Patches and Buttons. I called her Buttons because she had on top of her head, between that white stripe that went through her ears, up there at the top of her head, she had what I call a dot whack, black spot, like a button. And I said, oh, that's her button to engage. And then Patches was my son's dog, and that's what he wanted to name him, was Patches, because in the white where you can't see in this photo, he's got some black splotches here and there, kind of like Patches. And so that was them, and we ended up with the two because my son said, oh, can we get him, Mom? He really likes me. And I had chose Buttons immediately, not only for her coat, but because I instantly could tell this dog could run energies, and I needed energy runners. I always made sure any animal I brought into my home knows how to deal with energy, because my homes have always been high energy homes as far as otherworld activities. Everything from shadows seeing out of the corner of your eye. You'd see someone go through a room. You'd see orbs, sometimes full body apparitions. Sometimes we'd have a little bit of poltergeist activity, especially when my very psychically gifted daughter started really opening up to her gifts and hitting, 12 years old, that time when all things start getting chaotic. And so lot of things going on, and I absolutely had to make sure I had animals that could hang in that kind of environment. And what we didn't realize when we got them, because I didn't pay close enough attention as I should have to Patches, Patches was having a lot of issues. And that dog was apparently not a good energy runner. And Buttons, in fact, would often provoke him when they'd get outside, or I'd let him outside, or she would start wrestling with him in the house, and I'd say, all right, you guys need to go outside with that. And the minute I'd open the back door, she'd take off and he'd go after her. And they would run these crazy figure eights through the yard and all this and that, and just nuts. And it wasn't until several years later when I had a very gifted friend who unexpectedly had lost her husband, came and stayed with me for a little bit until she got her life sorted. And so she sat in the backyard with Patches one day, and I came home from work and went out because she spent most of her day in the yard. She was a smoker, and I had quit smoking years before, and so my Mesa home, I never allowed smoking in that home at all. But she was sitting out there, and I got out there and I says, what have you been doing all day? She goes, I've been working with Patches, and I've figured out what's going on with that dog. And I said, well, what's that? And she says, he doesn't know how to release energy. I said, you're kidding me. I said, his sister's got it in spades. She goes, yes, and you know how she always provokes him to chase her and everything? She's getting him to burn off the energy because he can't figure out how to release it through his feet and let Gaia handle it. So she worked with him and taught him how to transfer, rather than storing all that energy, how to transfer it down through his feet into deep into the earth and let Mother Nature take it from there. And during that time, in figuring that out, it was a major blessing because he also had developed terrible anxiety issues of gut, and poor thing would go to eat and then he'd want to get outside real quick and he'd throw up, and then he'd come in and finally eat a little more and that'd be okay. But if he wasn't going at one end, he was going at the other, not to be graphic, but he had serious problems. And I also became aware that he was always chewing on my rocks. And I'm like, what is up with this dog? I've never had a dog select my rocks and chew on them like he did. And I was always on him, Patches, give me back that rock, And I was taking a course on stone elixirs and learning how to make stone elixirs for healing, for internal work, whatever. And I thought, I just wonder. So I started paying attention to the rocks that he was always going after. And they were all about third chakra. They were, if he wasn't in the citrine, he was in, I've still got a beautiful chevron, six-sided ametrine. And he sensed that citrine in it. And in fact, it's got a nice yellow swath that runs along it. And that thing was crystal clear, but from all his chewing, it's got occlusions all through it. Now, I still have the stone, but yeah, he chewed the heck out of that thing. But sunstone, what else? Anything yellow. My yellow calcites, he wanted those. Oranges, yellows. I think he even grabbed a bloodstone, which kind of surprised me, but not later when I got thinking about it. But even my peridot. And peridot, as you're probably well versed, is a light green. It has a yellow hue to it. So typically, it was one of my workers in my, because I used to do a lot of stone layouts for chakra balancing at that time. And I always had it in my bowl for heart chakra. It was one of those, but he got it out of there. I had left the bowls down one time, and that's all it took. But so I started setting aside the stones that he was going after, and then I created an elixir for him. And I got to tell you, that dog was not dumb. He knew what he needed. He was trying to tell me what he needed. And once I finally keyed into him, I said, oh, okay. And from then on, it was elixir that went into his water dish, and his stomach resolved, his issues resolved. And then compounded on top with Chris working with him to finally release energies, and with the help of his sister, of course, picking up when he was gathering too much. It brought that dog a long way from where he had been. But, and here's just another picture of Shadow and the pups when they were still pups. But look at how happy she is. That tail was in the process of wagging. She was in seventh heaven. She could play with those guys all she wanted. She'd roughhouse with them. I mean, they were her puppies. And so they started calling her Mama. And I had been in the habit, after her having litters, of calling her Mama Dog as her nickname. And so she was just Mama Dog from that point on. Now here's a great picture of Mr. Patches. And note, he's got his paw resting in his water dish. This dog always had to be around some kind of water source. And I had bought them a little plastic kiddie pool, thinking that he would, really enjoy that, which he did. But he also enjoyed chewing holes in it, and so it didn't hold water for too long. And I finally just got a number 2 galvanized tubs. You older viewers will probably be well versed in a number 2 galvanized tub. But I got that for their water dish, and inevitably he would be sitting in it. If I'd go outside looking for him, there he'd be sitting in his water. And I don't think his sister appreciated it too much. She's always looking at him like, you dim bulb, what's wrong with you? But this is them when they were pretty much full grown. You can see her dot rack up there in the center of her head. She's in the foreground there of the picture, and she's kind of pinning him to the wall. I think she's trying to get him to chase her, because this is in the front hallway that would lead around. We had like a circuit in the house. You go from the hallway to the living room, through an archway to the dining room, through another archway into the kitchen, and then out the pantry and out to the back door, back hallway, and the back half of the house. But that's them full grown. And by that time, we lost Shadow. Let's see. It was my kid's senior year. So 2002. She had been failing. She had been getting a lot thinner over time. And I knew she probably had cancer or something, but I had promised her that I wouldn't euthanize her. She didn't want that. She realized what had happened to Sooner, and she's like, no, I'll just, stubborn pit bull to the end. I'll go out my own way. And so she was getting more and more frail, and I said to her, Shadow, don't you think it's about time that you cross the bridge? And she says, no, I don't think so. I want to wait until KW, that's my son Keith, we always called him KW. I want to wait until he comes home for summer break. And then when he goes back up to school, then I'll go. And I'm like, okay. So summer came. She had her summer with Keith, and they played. And, he could see how she was diminishing, and he knew what she had said about her leave time. And so he reluctantly went back up to school. And about that time, a neighbor came over to visit, and she had become a good friend. She was a Reiki master, and we had collaborated a lot. Herself, she had a dear friend who also was a Reiki master from her church, and she introduced us. And I always have to stop and pause with this woman's name, because her name is Lorraine. But I always wanted to call her Eni, and I never could understand why I wanted to call her Eni. And then I had a remembrance in one of our sessions that we were all collaborating together. And I realized that she had been a family member, and I couldn't quite decipher if she was a little sister or a cousin that lived with us and we raised. But her name was Rowene, and I always referred to her as Eenie. And so from the first time I met her, my mouth would start to form Eenie, and I would have to stop and think of her name and put it into my mouth before I could ever spit it out. And so we kind of had a good joke about that when I finally told her what my holdup was, why I had such a hard time with her name. But anyway, Debbie, the neighbor, sat down with Shadow and started talking with her. And she was a more clear communicator than I was. I would get the images and pictures, and I'll tell you a side story about that in a minute, but I'll finish this on Shadow. But she says, well, Shadow's telling me that, yeah, she knows her time is close, but she has certain things she'd like to have you do if you would. And I said, oh, she knows I'll do anything for her. What is it? And she says, well, she wants to be buried under her favorite tree in the backyard. And I said, yes. And I sent her an image of the tangerine tree. That it was a big tree that gave lots of shade, and she loved to lay under there when she was done playing. And the other two liked it too, but she confirmed that's the tree. That's where I want to be. And then she said, well, she's telling me that she wants to pass away in her favorite chair, but she doesn't want to make it a mess because she knows sometimes, things release after death, and she doesn't want to mess up your chair. And I told her, Shadow, you can be in your favorite chair. I will cover it with an old bedspread, and you won't have to worry about any mess. If it happens, it happens. Not a problem. And so that was okay. And then, what was the third? There was a third thing that I'm not thinking of now. But anyway, so she let all her wishes be known. And so we made sure that happened for her. But I did want to share about, what was it? It was something to do, with the communication. I had been a couple of summers before this, as an aside, and then we'll talk about her passing. But a couple of summers before, I had gotten Sonia Fitzpatrick's book, The Animal Communicator, and she gives good instruction on there on how to communicate effectively with your animals. And so I had been working with that. And I was on vacation at the time, and a good friend of mine's, her second son spent a lot of time in my home growing up. His teen years were pretty rough at home. He and his stepdad would get into it, and there'd be problems. And so he'd come up and live with me sometimes a month, 2 months, 6 months at a time. And then even in his 20s, when he was between places, he came and lived with me for a little while. But I would always ask him to babysit the animals when the kids and I would go up to Utah for vacation. And so he was babysitting the house and the dogs. And this particular morning I decided, okay, I'm going to try some communication here with the animals. And I first tuned into Shadow because I'd had her the longest, and she and I communicated well together pretty much. And so I tapped into her, and the first thing I got was just energetic kisses. She was licking me, and just a big, warm, loving hug. She just exuded love. She was totally a mama. And I was like, okay, so I've got Shadow. Okay, let me try Buttons. And Buttons was her usual, energetic self. Hey, Mom, what are you doing? Why are you bugging me? What's up? And I was like, okay, I got her. And she was busy doing something. So then I keyed into Patches. And I thought something was wrong, because all of a sudden my stomach just started flipping over, and I thought, oh, am I going to get sick? What's going on here? And about that time, the phone rang. And this was in the days before cell phones. So I got out of bed to answer the landline in my parents' basement. And it was Wayne, my house sitter. And one thing about Patches, you had to watch him like a hawk, because if anything was left on the counter, on the stove, and it was too far forward, he would get into it and eat it all. So Wayne knew from living with me that you always made sure things were to the back of the stove or the back of the counter if you were leaving food out, because, if the kids wanted seconds or something, I'd leave stuff out until they were done. And so I said, "What's going on, Wayne?" He goes, well, and he always called me Auntie. Auntie, uh, I, I, are apple pies okay for dogs? And I'm like, well, probably not the best choice, but, you know, what happened? And he says, well, I, he says, I baked some apple pies because I'm going to my girlfriend's house to meet her parents. And I guess they were getting pretty serious. And so he thought, I'm going to make some pies and impress the family, that I'm not a dullard. I know how to handle myself in the kitchen and in a house. And so he says, well, Patches got into one of the pies and he's eaten about half of it before I realized. And I said, well, okay, that explains the bellyache. So I'll tell you, it's not going to kill him, but you better make sure that dog has plenty of access to the backyard because he's going to need it, or you're going to be cleaning up some messes. And he goes, oh, okay. So he had made sure Patches was all straightened out before he left to go to the girlfriend, get her, and then to her parents' house. But that was one of my early long distance communications with my animals. I was tuning into that guy's gut. But okay, so now back to the leaving of Shadow. So I realized it had been about a week since my neighbor had been over and had that conversation with her. And I said to her, Shadow, you're such a stubborn little pit bull. And during that week, she was getting to the point where she was so frail she couldn't take herself outside. I'd have to carry her out, set her on the grass, and hold her while she squatted to do her business, and then pick her up and take her back in the house. Well, on the weekend before her passing, and this is another reason I knew she was getting short, I had carried her out there, and the other dogs scooted by me, and they were out in the yard playing, and she always loved to run and play with them. But she's watching them, and she's so gaunt. I mean, she's literally skin over bone and can't hold herself. But I let go of her a little bit because I wanted to see if she could stand there okay, because she had kind of a wide stance, and I thought maybe she could handle herself. And in that moment, her head darted up, and she spied at the end of our good-sized yard a cat on the fence. And the other two dogs started barking, and she instinctively thought she was a young dog again, I guess. And this only time I ever saw this happen in an animal, but she literally leapt out of her body. She was a good almost 10 inches from her body. Her whole soul just jumped forward, going after that cat. And then it got that far, like I say, 10 inch on the tether, or 12, snapped back into her body, and she literally just fell over. And I thought, oh boy. So now that happened on the weekend. I'm watching her fade. Every day she'd be up in her chair, and as I had promised her, I had it covered. And I'd think every morning when I woke up, oh, maybe she's passed. And I'd look in, and she'd be so out. Oh, good, she's crossed. And then that tail, bing, 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 bing. Yeah, you know how pit bulls are, if you've had them or been around them. And I just, oh, here we go. So finally, that Thursday, I said, all right, Shadow, apparently you're worried about whether or not I'll bury you where you want to be buried. So I carried her outside, and I laid her down and literally let that dog watch me dig her grave. And she laid there and she watched the whole thing. And once I had it done, I picked her up and brought her back in the house. And I set her back in her chair and just sat there with her and, petting her and telling her, it's time, baby. You need to go to Sooner. And then as I sat there petting her, and this went on for a good hour, I became aware that Buttons and Patches were sitting probably about 4 feet from us. And they were sitting there like little centurions. They just were quietly watching vigil, watching their mama dog pass, is what they were doing. And I heard my daughter in her bedroom, and she started to come into the living room. I heard her laughing. And she says, "Oh, Mama, Sooner's here." I said, "I know, I can feel him chasing his tail." He used to do this thing where he would chase his tail, and then I'd say, "All right, unwind," and he'd reverse course, and he would chase the other way. And I always figured it kept him from getting too dizzy doing that. But he was chasing his tail, and I had already sensed him in the room, and the other two had scooted over a little bit. They acknowledged that he was there. And so she came out, and she goes, it's getting time for Shadow." I said, "I know." And so she sat down on the couch, and I was still there on the floor, petting and loving on Shadow. And as she drew her last breath, I told her, Go be with Sooner. Go be with your mate." And in my mind's eye, I could see them both take off running into a meadow. And that's how she crossed. Excuse me a second. Sorry, that always gets a little emotional for me to retell that story. But I took her out that night. As soon as she'd passed, I got out my stethoscope, made sure she was really gone. And I listened to her, the last heartbeat. And I waited a little bit, and then I took her out to put her in her grave, which I did, and covered her up. And for about 6 months after she passed, I'd say easily 6 months, the two, Buttons and Patches, would still go out and play in the yard. But whenever they'd come close to her grave, they would stop running, reverently look to it, and then tiptoe quietly past it, and then resume running. And this went on, like I say, for about 6 months. And when I realized they were finally over their grief was when I set them out one day and was watching them. And they started doing their figure eights through the yard, and they just ran right over her grave and kept, because she was right on the track where they liked to run, that circuit they ran. And they didn't even stop. The grass had all grown in. They knew she was there, but they were over the grief stage of it. And so they were just being themselves again. And so I thought, okay, good. They've gotten past this. But I'll tell you, for the next 2 seasons, we had the most beautiful yield of tangerines from that tree, just loaded with tangerines. I was giving away because we couldn't eat them all, and I always gave bags to people anyway, but I'd hang a bag at the common fence for my neighbor next door, and they'd come grab the bag of tangerines and take them in, or grapefruit, because I had several grapefruit trees too, so I'd always share those. And yeah, beautiful, beautiful tangerines because of her. And every time I'd pick tangerines, I'd thank her for blessing that tree with her nutrients and blessing our family. But I then moved. The next year is when I moved to Mesa, and no, I guess we were in Mesa. I take that back, because she was buried in the Mesa house in the yard. I'm losing track of all my critters. But a year or two, actually it was 2003. No, 2002, the fall of 2002, right after my kids graduated high school that spring. And I told him, well, guys, you know, Mama's a Rolling Stone. I've always been a gypsy in my soul, always moved around and did stuff. And I promised myself I would stay here in Arizona until you kids were through with school. I wouldn't uproot you and all of that. But I'm moving. And my daughter had gotten, she was a year ahead of my son, and she had gotten her first year at college under her belt. And she says, well, I'm going too. I want to get out of this heat. I don't, I'm ready for new adventures. And I'm like, okay. And my son said, well, I want to stay. He had a girlfriend, another girlfriend. And so I said, okay, well, and I knew a couple of his friends well. And I said, why don't you three rent the house till I can get it sold? And, you guys take care of the home and all of that. And so that's what we did. And he had Patches because Patches was his dog. And my family had laid down the law. My sister and I did a road trip up to Oregon because she was telling me after her husband had passed that she was needing more and more help with our mother, especially. Our mother was already in early dementia. And, our dad was fine, but, she needed a buffer. And I said, okay, well, I'm not moving back to Utah, I can tell you that. I said, I've been thinking about Oregon because it was a lot like the Bay Area was when we were growing up. And I had a friend that lived in Medford and was, you got to come up here and check this out because it's so much like the Bay Area and da 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 da. So road trip, we came up to look at homes or decide what we were going to do. And the third day we were there, we contacted a realtor. And so she started showing us homes, and we pulled up in front of this one house. And as we were waiting for the realtor to come, I suddenly turned to my sister and I said, well, we don't have to look any further. And she says, what do you mean? I said, well, this is our house. And she goes, God, it's uncanny how you do it. How do you do that? I said, I always know what's my house. This is my house. I did the same thing with my Mesa house. I knew it was my house. And that was quite an adventure, getting that purchase. Dumbfounded my realtor in the long run. Kind of dumbfounded everybody. But that's how I roll. When Spirit says this is it, I know it's it. And in the case of that house, I knew that was the perfect house. It had exactly everything we wanted, and so we went in and looked at it. Yep, 4 bedrooms, 2 bath, separate library living area with a family room, wrap around into a kitchen setup. So, yeah, it was our house. And so we left there, and the next day we put in an offer, and it was accepted. And we left Oregon knowing we'd be moving within probably 6 months. Hi, mister. My little mister dog is in the kitchen wondering why I'm talking to myself. He should be used to that by now. I'll talk to anybody, including the walls. But anyway, so he probably wants a lap now that I think about it. Yeah, I'm getting lap messages from him. But anyway, so we were getting the house. We secured the home. My sister moved up. My sister and parents moved up, I want to say September, like the second week of September that year. My daughter had moved up the end of August. The lifelong friend that I had living there in Medford owned the home next door to her where her cousin that she was guardian over was living. And she lived alone, and so it was a great big house, and she didn't particularly like being alone. And so she offered a room to Katie. She says, you can live here rent-free, just help me with Gail as far as keeping her company and that sort of thing. And it worked out great. Katie was there for several years, and it allowed her to get it for her first taste of being on her own without having a lot of expense because she was in school. She was college student and couldn't work. And so, she it was just a blessing all around. Blessing for Gail, blessing for my daughter. Helped out my friend, and then over time it allowed for Gail and I to rekindle, um, because Gail had gone through public school up through the end of junior high, and she had been at my junior high school, and that's where I first remembered her from. And she was always teased, and because she had the mentality of about a 7-year old. She had no business in school, but her mother was really living in a illusion that somehow this girl could be normal, could do normal things. She even tried to let her drive at 16, and after hitting about the fifth parked car and the insurance claims that were going to come, her mother decided, well, maybe that's not a good idea. But because this gal lived with her parents until they passed, and then my friend took guardianship of her, um, she was not socialized well, and she was a handful. And I was about the only person, other than my friend, that could tolerate her or handle her, or that she would mind, like a little kid. And I would use my mom voice with her when she would start trying to be nasty. I'd say, Gail Marie. Yes, she'd say. She always had the funniest voice. Yes, Betty. I'll be nice. But there's many Gail stories to share too. But anyway, there was a time after my daughter moved out, and Gail was being difficult, that luckily I had a home business at that point. I was doing transcription work. And so I could put whatever documents I was working on a thumb drive, go over to my friend's house, to her office, and I could resume working. But I would be in the house. She usually wanted me there 3-4 hours a day to be with Gail and keep her company, and all of that. And so that worked out well, until we finally, that arrangement ended. And I think that mostly ended because we were moving up here where we are now, and we're like 4.5 hours from Medford, so I couldn't continue watching. But she went into a nursing home at that point, and she has since passed. I think she passed away in 20 or 21. But yeah, that was that situation. And dogs. And poor Gail had a neurotic dog, Max. And he was neurotic because Gail was neurotic. And I was the only person that he would calm down for. And he would curl up on my lap and shake and shake and shake until I'd convince him that he could calm down and it was okay. I had him, nothing was going to happen to him, and then he'd relax. And she'd always say, Betty, Max is upset. Can you come over and see Max? Okay, so I would come up to her house, settle Max down, tell her to be sweet with him, stop yelling at him and all that. And then usually about that time, Katie would get home from her classes for the day, and then she was in the house, and that would divert Gail, and poor Max got a break. But yeah, always dogs, always this situation with dogs. Now, did I tell you about my crazy Roxy? I don't think I did. Crazy Roxy. I came up here, as I said, with Buttons, and Buttons became a whole different dog moving to Oregon. She never got to be out because it was always so stinking hot in Arizona, and she had little soft paws, they call them, the pink pads, and so she was very sensitive on the concrete and stuff. And so the only time she ever got to go anywhere other than her backyard was to go to the vet or something like that sort. So we moved to Oregon, and she became a completely different animal. She got to go in the forest hiking. She got to go on trails. She got to go camping. She got to go to, there was a park we used to take the dogs to, and it had a big river that ran along this one area. It was down at the lower end of the park, and it had a big strip of grass where the dogs could run and play. And then Buttons figured out that she loved rivers, and she would walk out on the shelf of that river as far up, clear up to her elbows, drink, 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 and then she'd realize, okay, the rapids are starting, and she'd turn around and come back. But she that particular park had a pay station that you'd have to stop, get an envelope, put a few bucks in it before you could go into the park. And so she learned over time, because that dog literally would laugh when she figured out we were going to the park. And as soon as we'd take the first turn off to head towards the park, she would start laughing. I'm serious. And she would keep that up. And as we got into the park, that would literally turn into screams. Oh, just so excited. And we'd have to stop to put the money in the envelope. And she would just get off, let's get there. And we'd tell her, we got to put the monies in the envelope first, and then we can go in. And so she figured that out pretty darn quick. And one day my sister and I are in the library, and I'm at my computer desk and she's over at her computer desk. And every morning she would be doing her banking and whatever. And she says, "Hey sis, I think your dog's hitting me up for an allowance." And I said, "What?" She goes, "She's over here asking me if I have monies." And I said, "Oh, for God's sakes." I said, "Buttons, what do you need with monies? You don't even have pockets. You got nowhere to put money." And she starts sending us images of water, of the river and the park. And it's like, she wants to go to the park. And because I worked a second shift at that time, it worked out quite often that we could take them, her and this little one, Lily. We still had Lily there. There we are. And oh, for Pete's sake, there it is, the little gray girl. When I had Buttons, and so the two of them learned to play together and get along, and Buttons figured out little dogs and how they play, and so they could play cute together. But yeah, she wanted money. She wanted to go to the park, and that's all there was to it. And Lily was a very smart dog. Before Mother got too far into her dementia, she would go out walking every morning, and we'd always have her take Lily for a walk, was what we were telling her, take Lily for a walk. But we knew that Lily would make sure she got home. And she did more than once, Mother admitted. "Boy, this little dog is smart. If I start to turn the wrong direction, she just plants her feet and she will not move until I tell her, 'All right, Lily, just, I guess Grandma's confused. Go ahead and just get us home.' And then she would follow the dog home on the leash. The dog would be leading the way. And so over time, when Mother got really bad, and she insisted that we put her in a group home, and there was one in our neighborhood that was just up and around a couple blocks from us. So we took, for Pete's sake. And anyway, Mother agreed that that's where she wanted to be, was that group home. And so we moved her over there, but Dad would often go walk up and get her and put her in her wheelchair and then bring her down to the house for the afternoon, and then, we'd head back with her. But at any rate, she began to confuse Roxy's Air, the little tan and white Jack Russell, with Lily, the little gray one there at the end of the picture. And she would say, "Oh, Roxy, you're so good to get Grandma home." And I was, we wouldn't correct her or anything. But we lost Lily probably when Roxy was 2. And that's when my sister got Callie. Callie is a fox terrier curled up in the pink bed. And my Roxy is stretched out next to her. And she was a Jack Russell rat terrier mix. She was a long-legged Jack. And I used to call her a Jack rat because she acted like a little jackrabbit, for one thing. But she had a brain like scrambled eggs, is the way my husband described it when he tried to tap into her. He said, "No. This dog, the only overriding thought she has is that she wants her mama." And I thought, oh boy, poor thing. And she would ride along with me to go up when I'd get my massages. She'd wait in the car for an hour for me to come back. Luckily, it's cool up here, and most of the time it wasn't, and I'd have plenty of air circulating for her. But she would rather wait in a car patiently in the shade for me to come out than to stay home wondering where I was and if I was coming home. And my husband said she literally would glue herself to the back of the couch, staring out the window and just caterwauling and keen, waiting for me to come home. And I thought, oh my God. And over time, I kept hoping as she got older it would get better, but it didn't. It got worse. And so eventually I had to have a talk with the vet. And we had spoken of it several times over the years. And she said, well, if you decide to do this, you're doing this dog a kindness to let her go. So we finally decided, yeah, it's that time. And we picked the day and then took her, and she's buried in our backyard. And before we lost her, we had a little flock of chickens. We had gotten the chickens when shortly after my sister got Callie. And of course, the little chicks, they had to be in a warmer in the house until they feathered out and could be outside. And so we had a galvanized tub that with a warming light that they were in, and we netted over it so that the dogs wouldn't pester them. And Roxy was always curious, and so she got her nose way down in that netting, and one of the little chicks jumped up and pecked her on the end of the nose, and that was the end of that. She gave the chickens a wide berth, but Callie wasn't quite sure. She'd kind of interact with them, but Callie was a definite food dog. And we would give the chickens the corn on the cob leftovers, and let them chew on the cob and peck the corn and all of that. And Callie really liked those. And she was upset one time. She saw them in their pen, and she started rooting, and to get one, and she didn't realize she literally got herself in the pen. And then she was shocked. How did I get in here with all these chickens? And she's freaking out and starts barking. And we come out, and here she is inside the pen. By this time, she picked up a corn cob to take with her on the way out. We're like, well, that'll learn you. And then after that, she was really frightened of the chickens. She didn't want anything to do with them. Well, over time, we started with these little 4 chickens. And we had Puff, was what my sister named this one. She was like a little cream puff, light feathered Buff Orpington was the breed, and they're prolific layers. And then we had another Buff Orpington that was russet color, and I named her Gladys for Gladys Kravitz. In fact, I would often call her Mrs. Kravitz because she was a busybody. She always was telling everything in the neighborhood who was doing what, and just a busybody. And she loved to announce when somebody had laid an egg, and we'd say, all right. And then we had Piper, another one, who was very vocal. And whenever she was on her soapbox, she would step up on this big rock that we had at the one end of their pen, and she'd be up there just holding town square, and carrying on and all that. And finally I'd stick my head out the door and say, Piper, will you pipe down? So her name fit her. And she'd get all disgruntled and get down off the stone like, well, how rude, and then she'd go back to her, whatever she was doing. And then we had little Mimsy. And Mimsy and Piper were both hybrids called sexlets. And they're supposed to be very prolific layers, which they were. These were all very prolific birds. But over time, that pack dwindled to the only one left was Mimsy. And so when my husband and I married, and we were renting a home just outside of Medford at the time, and my sister said, well, now that you've got a place, even though it's a rental, do you think they'd let you have the chicken? I said, well, what they don't know can't hurt them, I guess, because they've already agreed to the dogs. So sure enough, we brought Mimsy with us, and then we learned the world of chickens. Oh my goodness. This girl was a great communicator. She adopted us as her flock, and she would literally follow us on the outside of the house. She'd follow around us from room to room, wherever we were, and then she'd start clucking under the window of whatever room we were in to let us know, hey, I'm out here. I'd like to come talk to you too. So then we'd go out and we'd chat with her for a bit. She, over time, I had wine barrels, half wine barrels that I grew my herbs and lettuces in. And so I had one for my herbs and one for my lettuces. Well, once she figured out there was lettuce up there, that little bugger pretty much ate all my lettuce. And then I just didn't replant. I just turned the soil and let her have it. And she would sit up there and have a nap, or she used to love to dust her feathers in it, because if you know anything about birds, they use the loose dirt to dust their feathers. And so that's what she did. And then she loved to go around the outside of the house and look for bugs and scratch, peck, whatever she was doing. If we were out there gathering raspberries, she'd be right alongside me, and I'd pick one, and before I could get it in my bowl, she'd jump up and grab it. And so I'd get about every third raspberry would end up in the bowl, because Mimsy stealing raspberries always made for very interesting eggs, I might add. You'd find a raspberry seed in there somewhere. But she just was personality plus, and she loved to come and to the back door, the sliding door, where the doggy door was. She'd often sit in front of it because she could feel the cool air in the summer, and that would keep the dog from coming out too, because as long as the dog saw her there, she wasn't going to go out in the yard. So Mimsy was pretty bright that way, but she also would come up to that sliding door, and I'd hear she'd be pecking at the door, wanting some attention. So I still had my transcription business then, and my husband, luckily, from probably after we were married, when we first got engaged, it was shortly after that he took a different job that was out of state, and they allowed him to work from home. So he's worked from home for 10 years. It's been wonderful. And great during COVID, I might add. But anyway, I would go out and see what Mimsy wanted. No, she'd just want to chat. And so we'd have a little chat, and I'd say, okay, are you good for a while? Yeah. And she'd hop down off the stoop, and then she'd go back to chasing bugs or doing whatever she was doing, because, bird. But this one day, I hear her. I'm like, oh, gads, what's she up to now? So I go, open the door, and I'm talking to her, and I look down, and her feet are absolutely filthy. They're muddy. She had been obviously around to the far side of our yard, where we had a bed of bushes and different things, but it was all just soil. And she loved to go get under the bush there and have a nap, or she would look for bugs there. But it was pretty moist after a rain we had had. I mean, her feet were filthy, and I looked down at her, and I said, Mimsy, your feet are filthy. Would you look at those feet? And she looked down, and she looked up at me, and she was embarrassed, and she got down off the stoop, and she left, and so I shut the door. She wasn't gone maybe 10 minutes, pecking at the window. What is it, Mimsy? She goes like this, I kid you not. Holds up one foot, holds up the other foot, like, look at me. And I'm like, oh my God, they were wet. Toenails were glistening. Feet were clean as a whistle. I'm like, well, look at you. You got your feet all cleaned up. What a good girl you are. And then she was all proud of herself, and she left. But she always loved to have conversation. My husband's next to the youngest brother came up and stayed with us for a while, and he would sit out on our back deck and talk to that bird for hours. He'd come in and say, she's a kindred spirit, because he's a redhead, so him and the red chicken, they got along great. And I'm like, well, she might be red. I guess she likes you. She likes that red hair, and so even he, would communicate with her all the time. Well, when we moved up here, Um, of course, the house configuration changed. We had a big deck that we had never had at the rental. So she learned how to climb the stairs to get up on the deck, just like a human. She would step over step. She'd come up the stairs, and then she couldn't jump to the windows anymore because they're higher than what they were at the rental. And so one day I'm looking at the kitchen window and I see whoop, whoop, and then cluck, 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 cluck. And I'm like, what is that crazy bird doing? And I had a little table. I had a couple of chairs set at that side of the deck and a little table in between. So if somebody had a drink or, you know, we have family members that smoke. So if somebody wanted to smoke, they could be out there and have a little table and all of that. So, um, yeah. So I'm looking out and I see Mimsy. She's up on that table and she's jumping up and down trying to get attention. She wants somebody to come out and chat with her. So I step out the door here off of our library where those chairs were, and I sit down in one and she hops up in the other one across from me. And we proceed to cluck and talk to each other for a good 10 minutes before she finally was satisfied. And I said, have you had enough? Yeah, I've had enough. All right, then I better get back in and get busy doing stuff, you know. And so, and this is how it rolled. Well, when we first moved to this home, my son and his family were living on this side of the house. We have a large home here, and we have 3 bedrooms, 2 baths on just down that hallway. And so they were living on this side of the house. They had the living room. They had pretty much free run to the kitchen, and then this library that was all theirs to utilize, and then we utilized the other half of the house. But I always had to put a post-it note when we were going to free range Mimsy, because we had gotten Sugar and Mr., who we call Mr., but he was Pee-wee as his name as he was when we adopted them. But I'd always put a note out on the door so the grandkids wouldn't mistakenly let the dogs out, because even though Roxy didn't give 2 hoots about the chicken and would not bother her, if you know anything about Chihuahuas, you know they like to chase chickens and kill chickens if they get a hold of them. And Sugar was just very curious. She wanted to know what this orange feathery thing was, and so she was always checking her out. And I think Mimsy even pecked her on the nose one time when she got a little too nosy in her pen, and so she backed off of her. And oh, you're that way, are you? But there was this one day when I had Mimsy free ranging in the rest of the yard, and I had put up the post-it note, and one of the grandsons let the dogs out and didn't see the note or whatever, or maybe I started doing the notes after that occurrence. But anyway, they were let out, and the next thing I hear is all of this commotion in the backyard, and I'm hearing coming from the back deck, "Mom! Mom!" And so I ran to the French doors that are off of our back hallway that goes down to our bedroom and office area. And I saw Mimsy running pell-mell for that door. I see Sugar hot on her heels, and Pee-wee, and my husband trying to get a hold, even the tail, anything to get a hold of Sugar long enough to stop her before she got to the bird. And so I threw open the door, and Mimsy literally jumped, fluttered into my arms, and her little heart was just a beating. And I went, oh my goodness, and I turned my back and shut the door at the same time, and then realized the doggy door was open, so I put the breakdown on that so that they couldn't get into her that way until Walter could get the dogs under control. And that probably was the time after that I ended up putting up the sign, because even still with the sign, the grandkids would always double check. Grandma is they call me Granby. But Granby, is Mimsy in her pen, or is she running loose? And I'd say she's in her pen or whatever. And so they could let the dogs out. But it was the funniest thing. I had never heard her scream for mama like that ever. Um, and I communicate more in pictures with them. That's how they communicate mostly anyway. They'll send you a download of pictures and then you have to decipher it. Um, my little finches used to send me waterfalls when they wanted their water freshened up. And sure enough, I'd go and it'd be a chore, and my son had forgotten to do that morning before school. And so, yes, they had feathers and stuff in the water and it looked nasty. And so I'd freshen up their feeder and their water for them and before I'd leave for work. But yeah, poor Mimsy. And she just laid her little head on my shoulder and just like, oh man, I almost got snagged. But, and then it was not too long after that, I had had my second knee replacement on my other leg. And it was still winter, and it had been a long winter that year and real cold. And poor Mimsy, Walter kept a heating lamp in her condo. We always had plenty of straw and wood shavings, anything to keep her warm. But he says, oh, she's so sad out there because of this cold weather and she really misses you. She wants to see you. And he and I both agreed that I shouldn't be out on that. If there was still ice or anything on that deck, it was slick as all get out. And he's like, no, you don't need to fall. So about a month after that, spring started rolling around. And I had gone out. I'll never forget this day because I have learned to be very careful when I start admiring my animals because inevitably something's going to happen. So Mimsy, I had let her out of her pen and she was so gorgeous. The sun was hitting her feathers and she had had a late molt that year. And so it took a while for her feathers to come in. And if any of you have seen a bird go into molt, it's a god-awful thing. When they're growing those feathers back, they look gangly and awful. But she looked so beautiful, and I picked her up and loved on her, and I grabbed her little head and kissed her neck and loved on her, and then I set her down to go play. We have a stand of trees in the backyard that we used to call our little grove. I guess we still do. We had a nasty freeze, took out part of it, but it's coming back now. But she loved to be under those trees, and she would scratch, peck, doing her thing, her chicken thing, looking for bugs. And she could be under there all afternoon and just be content as could be. Well, she had learned over time. She was 9 years old. She was a smart chicken. And she had learned to pay attention to ground intruders that might come after her. And this girl, we used to call it her ninja stance. She reminded me of what was it? The kung fu movie with the kid, the Karate Kid, because she'd put her wings out real big and she'd stand up on one leg and just like daring them. Come here, you want some of this? I'll give you some of this and then some. And so she protected herself very well against ground predators. Didn't think about aerial predators though. And this particular day that she was out, and she had been out all